Welcome to Microcollege. This week on the podcast, we're very excited to have as our guest Laura Marcus, who is one of my heroes, one of the real leaders and movers and shakers in this burgeoning microcollege movement. Laura is the co-executive director of the Tidelines Institute in Gustavus, Alaska, in the region of Glacier Bay. Before that, part of the ancestry of Tidelines Institute, she was the founder of the Arete Project, which was a Deep Springs-inspired initiative project in higher education. She holds a bachelor's degree from Yale and a master's of philosophy from Cambridge, and is working on her doctorate from Stanford. Thank you for joining us today, Laura.
Thanks, Jacob. It's great to be here.
So here on the podcast, we'd like to begin with people's biographies. So could you take us back to when you were 18, 19, 20 years old? Where were you? What were you doing? And what about that time influenced your decision to dig into this kind of work?
Sure, that's a great question. So I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, kind of sandwiched in between the city center and the suburbs. And Indianapolis is a very spread out city. So for folks who are familiar with it, you'll kind of know what I mean. I went to a huge public high school with about 4,000 students and was really lucky to get a great education there. I had some really wonderfully supportive teachers. I got to take classes and basically everything that interested me. So I have a lot of really positive memories of my own time in high school. But kind of towards my senior year, and as I started getting more serious about my college search, that's really around the time that I started thinking seriously about education and specifically about what I wanted out of higher education. And during that time, a couple of my most important influences and interlocutors on the subject were my maternal grandparents, both of whom were educators, and both of whom had thought deeply and seriously about education, both conventional and alternative. And so they have remained really important parts of my educational journey and my intellectual community, thinking about education up until their passings within the last few years. And kind of the big question that I became focused on around that time really had to do with what seemed to me to be this disconnect between the stated mission and vision, both of my high school, but also basically all the colleges that I was applying to, and the actual way that the educational experiences were structured at those institutions. So on the one hand, pretty much all of these schools were talking a really big game about education for service and leadership and citizenship and taking responsibility for a community and for the world and for the future. And yet, the actual structure of the education at all of these schools seemed to have nothing to do with that. It was all about cultivation of this very individualistic vision of educational attainment. So having the highest GPA, having the most extracurricular activities, having the best leadership positions and the shiniest resume, right? That seemed to be the actual goal. And that seemed to have so little to do with the stated goal of preparing people to really take responsibility for a community. And so, yeah, that just kind of generated some real cognitive dissonance in my own head and got me really excited when I stumbled across Deep Springs as part of my college search, because finally I felt like I had found an educational institution that was not only doing something pretty radically different, but also really walking the walk in terms of aligning educational vision with the structure of the education. So you know this well as a Deep Springs alum, but to be at a school where the work that you are doing both inside and outside the classroom really matters, for the people around you and really has consequences for the community, that seemed to me to be a much truer model for producing the kind of servant leaders that every school talks about. And certainly this is jumping ahead a little bit, but certainly I felt like that was borne out in the time that I spent at Deep Springs and what I saw of students and their own educational journeys there. So I was really taken with Deep Springs and wanted to go there. Of course, it was only open to men at the time. So for obvious reasons, that did not work out for me, which I was bummed about. But, I ended up going to Yale and had, honestly, again, a really great educational experience there, especially coming from a big public school in Indiana. I felt like I really found intellectual community with people my own age for the first time, and found people who were just as passionate about learning and thinking and playing with ideas. And so I was kind of, in total paradise for most of my time there. But kind of again, towards the end of my time at Yale, I found myself thinking about Deep Springs again. And it was not only having to do with, again, this cognitive dissonance between the structure of the education, the educational vision, which was even more pronounced at Yale, where there is a huge emphasis on being the best. And, by that point, it was getting the best job or making the most money or getting into the best law school or med school or whatever. So that was still very much the case. And then the other thing that I was really feeling at that time was just that, and I remember having a conversation with a friend about this, just I might as well have been a brain in a vat. Like, no part of my being was really engaged with the educational work except my brain. And my brain was pretty happy at Yale. But the rest of me kind of felt like something was lacking. So, right, again, places like Deep Springs and places like I think a lot of microcolleges, which offer in many cases a much more holistic education that engages the body or the emotional or spiritual life or whatever, that felt like something that was missing from my own higher education for sure, and continued to be something that I was percolating on as my educational work transitioned from being a student to being an educator.
Yeah, that you're a precocious theorist of education, clearly, at a very early age, thinking about what is the outcomes and purpose of education. And I think that the linkage between service, which is so much trumpeted in the Deep Springs material, as you mentioned, many other schools as well, but clearly they're the core mission of Deep Springs, and its relationship to the particular activities of being at Deep Springs College, which are the three pillars, right? Not only the academics, but also the labor and this self-governance, the life of community there. It is not quite as linear as many educational theorists build their theories around, right? The life of the community is a very, very specific community there. That I wonder, so to complete the story here, or to continue the story, right? You were not able to go to Deep Springs as a student, but that one of the things I admire about you is that definitely hasn't stopped you from going to Deep Springs. You take it. How did you end up finding yourself at Deep Springs?
Right. So this is like such a funny story, and definitely I think the lesson behind this for young people is that you should never feel afraid to send a really, I don't know, ridiculously presumptuous email to somebody that you're interested in working for or with, because sometimes it might just work out. Who knows? But kind of towards the end of my senior year, actually with this same friend that I had the conversation with about just being a brain in a vat, we got into a big argument about Plato's Symposium, which we were both really into at the time. And the big question was, can men and women read that book the same way? And so this conversation ended up going on over a period of like multiple months, and we would kind of come back to it. And I can't even remember where we landed on the subject, if we landed anywhere at all. But basically, the question of deep springs and single-sex education sort of entered into that conversation somewhere. And so for the first time in, quite some time, I started really thinking about deep springs again. And the outcome of that was that somehow I decided at the relatively tender age of 21 that if Deep Springs was not going to admit women, that I was going to found the Deep Springs that would admit women. And I sent a very impetuous email to the then president of Deep Springs, David Neidorf, informing him of this fact. And to my great surprise and delight, he actually responded very positively to that email and very supportively. And I actually, I reread that email not too long ago, and the email immediately following that was me forwarding David's email to this friend of mine with a whole bunch of exclamation points. That was the entire message that I had to add to that. But David and I started talking. That eventually led to my getting to go visit Deep Springs. And this was right around the time that Deep Springs, the Board of Trustees had voted to transition the school to coeducation. So the hope was that that would happen in 2013. So I came away from my visit to Deep Springs, which was in early 2012, with an offer to come back as staff that fall to help with the transition to coeducation. So I eagerly accepted that and started there in September 2012, mostly working on student recruitment. So trying to recruit the first co-ed class to the school, but then also serving. I was on the applications committee. I was on the transition committee. So, figuring out things like advising and sexual harassment policies and how are we going to do bathrooms now, and all that sort of thing. So that's how I ended up there. And that's kind of what I was doing, at least for the first year that I was at Deep Springs. But I was really lucky to be able to kind of get to imbibe from the general environment and shadow a class and take horsemanship and participate in the day-to-day life of the college and the educational life of the college, as well as just sort of, my own little corner of administrative work.
So that I'm wondering about what you had developed a strong concept of Deep Springs about that point by the time you actually ended up in the Valley, and I'm wondering how being there, how was that complexified or changed by the direct experience of doing the things you just described?
Yeah, so I think I had these like very idealistic visions of what Deep Springs was. And I think in some ways those were borne out and then some. And one example of this is I remember my very first AppCom meeting that I went to, and my previous job, I'd been in DC working for, I would say, like relatively dysfunctional, tiny environmental nonprofit. And that was not my jam. I didn't really like DC that much. But coming to Deep Springs and just watching this like 20-year-old run this meeting so efficiently, productively, humanely, it just seemed like, how does a 20-year-old know how to run a meeting better than my 40-something boss in DC who's a professional wearing a suit? And this guy is like maybe 20 in like a beat up Carhartts and whatever, like coming from his Hegel class. So I was deeply, deeply impressed by what self-governance elicited from students and what that kind of responsibility actually called these very young people up to, because they fill pretty big shoes and make pretty big decisions, and they do that really well. for people so young. I think the thing that surprised me, and this is something that I've continued thinking about a lot, because now I run programs like this too, and especially coming at it from a perspective of someone kind of in like formal adult leadership. This is always sort of weighing on my mind, is just kind of the intensity of community life. It's not part of the 3 pillars, but it is so much the beating heart of Deep Springs, for good and for ill, and changed so dramatically while I was there. I was really lucky to be there at a time that was, I think, very functional in terms of the community, both among students and among faculty. But I think it was at a moment where that whole community was just kind of transitioning from like out of a state of dysfunction. And it was really remarkable to see how just the individual personalities present so significantly changed the experience of living and working there, even over a short period of time. So that's something very much at the forefront of my mind now, especially at the beginning of our admissions season at Tidelines, is what it takes to build a really functional, really generative, and supportive educational community, and how to find those people, because it's not easy, from the standpoint of, sort of like a written application or even an interview. And I think it's something that Deep Springs grapples with all the time, as I'm sure we all do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So before we go too much deeper into this, I guess I want to zoom ahead a little bit. You had this, attraction to Deep Springs as a student, as a young person. Then you got to have this experience there as a staff person, really kind of ground truthing some of that, and must have, borne up enough to want to continue this idea of building something like that in a new place. So there was the Arete Project, which ran a series of summer programs in California and North Carolina, eventually in Alaska, with primarily people who were in universities somewhere else. Initially women, and then also a co-ed group in Alaska. I've got that all right?
Yeah.
Great. So that's a fascinating story, and I've enjoyed following it. I wanted to jump a little bit to where you are now, and if you could describe the Tidelines Institute. Let's start with where it is, and then what is the nature of the programs that you're running there?
Absolutely. So Tidelines Institute is an educational nonprofit based here along the Icy Strait Corridor in Southeast Alaska. So this is the northernmost entrance to Alaska's Inside Passage, which I think a lot of folks are familiar with. We operate out of 2 campuses, one here in my new hometown of Gustavus, Alaska, which is the gateway community to Glacier Bay National Park. It's a town of roughly 500 people. And then we have a second campus out at the Indian Islands, which is a remote archipelago about 25 miles west of here. So the mission of Tidelines is education for citizenship, stewardship, and leadership. So out of these 2 campuses, we are running courses of variable lengths that serve both local students and students from around the country. Probably the flagship program that we offer, and this is the one that I imagine we'll talk most about here today, is our gap year, which is called the Glacier Bay Year program. It's a 6-month program for students kind of in and around college age, so ranging from about 18 to 23, and structured around those same 3 Deep Springs pillars of education, labor, and self-governance. So all of our students who come to this program are partaking in all of those. And I think one major distinction between the gap year program and Deep Springs is that we have a fairly substantial place-based focus. So It's certainly not true of all of our courses, but many of our courses are trying to acquaint students in a really both deep and broad way with Southeast Alaska and with the kind of Pacific Northwest generally. So that includes courses on, local field ecology, Tlingit culture and history, just general kind of ethical, political, and historical approaches to this place. All of that has factored into various courses that we've taught here at Tidelines. And then, there are some others as well that really are trying to create intellectual space where students can engage with questions that they're encountering elsewhere in their day-to-day experience, whether that's in self-governance or labor or elsewhere. So this program has sort of been my baby and the one that I've been most excited to create and to run for years, because I've just been so taken by this educational model, but have also seen how much it requires in terms of time, especially for self-governance, in order to get students to a point of familiarity with the place and the program and the people that they can actually take responsibility for it. So this was much harder with a 1 or 2 month program, such as I was running under the auspices of Arete, just because, people need to get oriented before they can actually do anything. And it takes long enough to do that, okay, you get to the end of a month or 2 months and you feel like, okay, we're just getting to the point where we can make some decisions. And then everybody goes home and nobody sees each other ever again. The end.
Right. All of us in this space, I think, and especially with influence from Deep Springs, you've got this example of a program that has 2 years, right? You have people they're not only there 1 year, they're there 2 years. And so you have cultural memory, you have strong abilities for students to teach each other, to share those, to make mistakes and then have another chance to try it again the following year. So I think this is a fundamental design problem that we're wrestling with here for sure.
Totally. Yep. And we're kind of mulling over the same question. And, for a long time, the goal was to actually have a 2-year program a la Deep Springs. And I know, right, that's the direction the Outer Coast is going. And then we were talking about, okay, can we have a year-long program, but you have a cohort that starts in January and a cohort that starts in July. So there's always sort of, by the time one group shows up, there's a group that's already been there for 6 months who can show them the rope for the subsequent 6 months. And so these are all things that are kind of in the hopper right now in terms of program design. This is neither here nor there, but we have to get our infrastructure to the point that it can support that before we could make that move. And then there's the bigger question of whether that will actually work and we can find the students to fill those positions. Right. But yeah, that it's not as rich an educational experience when it's wholly iterative, which is the only kind of program that we've run, just because when you have those overlapping cohorts, it creates so much opportunity for peer leadership and learning. And that was the amazing thing about Deep Springs, is that so much of that responsibility was devolved from staff members to students, right. And the students just did it themselves. Second years would teach first years, and staff weren't involved, or if they were, it was sort of on the periphery. And man, that's such a great learning experience for students, and one that I think is hard to recreate unless you can give it that kind of time, and unless you can get the students to commit that kind of time.
Yeah. So where are your students coming from? Again, the size of the cohorts are how many?
So right now it's a super small program. The gap year is only 6 students. We hope to expand that to 12 to 15 starting in 2024. We're completing a new educational building in 2023, which will allow us to have a little bit more breathing room on campus. Right now we're in pretty close quarters. But yeah, once that happens, I think we'll up our numbers a little bit. And students come from all over the country. Because it is a 6-month program, we can't admit international students right now unless they're coming in with their own visas that will allow them to be around for 6 months. We're not kind of at the point where we can sponsor those yet. But yeah, this year, we had a student from New Jersey, a student from Michigan, a student from Kentucky, a couple students from California, and a student from New York. So yeah, kind of a pretty even geographic spread. And then alongside the gap year, we also run a series of short courses. Those more serve students from particular partner schools that we work with around the country, and then students who are based in Alaska and kind of around the Pacific Northwest.
Mm-hmm. And the age profile of the year students are they
college age, like 18 to 23. So we take students who are anywhere between right out of high school all the way up to right out of college.
Okay. And this is a program that begins in early summer, right?
Yeah, it does. Usually right after.
Through like why that is, but can you just say explicitly like why would you have this? It goes from late May to November. Is that right?
Yeah. And basically the reason for that is so that students are here during the bulk of peak season in Alaska. The very first gap year we ran started in January and went to August, and that was pretty intense. There was a lot of snow on the ground for the first 4 months that students were in Alaska. And, when they showed up, we were getting like 4 or 5 hours of daylight. And it was not the best way to start a program. So even though it's a little bit challenging vis-a-vis graduation schedules and all that, we did bump the start of the gap year to May and end in November so that students are around for, all of the summer hubbub, which allows us to, do field trips because the ferry is running reliably and go up in Glacier Bay and just like generally be outside because fall and winter can be kind of intense. Actually, winter and early spring are probably the most intense. Students are around for the fall season, and fall is my favorite time in Southeast Alaska. It's so rich. It's so abundant. The salmon are running. The berries are on the bushes. We're harvesting the garden. And our first gap year students missed all of that because they were gone by mid-August. And so I think it's a much better schedule and allows students to sink in much deeper to have them made in November, even though it doesn't quite align with the academic calendar.
Yeah. So you started to say a few of those things. So the labor pillar there is, really shaped by the place in so many ways. Can you say a bit more about the specific things that the students are doing during that in that kind of pillar of the program?
Yeah, for sure. So both of our campuses are more or less working homesteads. So students are divided up right now into 3 different labor teams. So there is a labor team that's kind of farm and garden. So they are working on the farm and garden with our garden educator and, growing the bulk of the produce that we eat over the course of the summer, caring for our flock of ducks and chickens. We're always talking about whether or not we're going to start another small animal operation, but I think that's probably a couple years down the line. There are students on our construction and maintenance team. So generally they do kind of one big construction project a year. So this year it was a bike and gear shed. The year before that, it was our kind of chicken coop and garden shed. I don't actually think we've pulled the trigger yet on exactly what it will be for 2023, but something kind of in that line. So students can learn kind of basic construction and framing skills. And then the rest of the time, they're doing minor motor maintenance or splitting firewood or kind of the other work that it takes to keep the place running. And then we also have students on kitchen team who are both preparing a couple of meals every day and then doing other kitchen projects like making sourdough and fermenting kombucha and, transforming berries into jam and salmon into smoked salmon and all that good stuff.
Yeah, amazing. Only some things you can only do in a few places in the world. So yeah, great. So I think something I wanted to take a chance to bounce off of you, Laura, is something I've been working on. So we've been participating for a number of years in this loose movement, which is I think taking some steps towards formalization or just a wider like awareness, whether we call them microcolleges or I don't know how would you describe how do you describe what you're doing to other people? Is there a word that you use?
This has been like the question because back when we were running like 1 and 2 month programs through Arete, everybody would call us a summer camp, and I was like, we're not a summer camp. So that was a sort of constant frustration. I think one of the sort of puzzles for us has been figuring out where we fit into the higher ed landscape and how we articulate exactly what it is that we're doing in a way that people will understand. Because I think that, running the summer programs through Arete was kind of a puzzle for students and parents and everyone else, as much as as much has been for us. So I think that we've kind of landed on the gap year nomenclature just because it's something that is very understandable and current right now. Ever since, I can't remember which one of Obama's daughters took a gap year, but one of them did. And then ever since that, everyone has been like into gap years, which I think is actually a really good idea. I think most people kind of need a break between high school and college or somewhere in that space. I kind of wish I had taken one. But we've kind of landed on that just in large part because it more or less accurately describes what we do, and it's comprehensible to the students that we're trying to recruit into it. I think the microcollege nomenclature is one that I'm kind of seeing increasingly catching on, which is exciting, in large part because I feel like there's so much need for innovation and experimentation in the higher ed space. And in some ways, the American higher ed system is set up really well for that. And in some ways, it is really not. And there are so many barriers to entry for new higher ed initiatives. So yeah, I'm stoked to see all of that taking off. And I think of Tidelines and the Glacier Bay year very much as sort of like a fellow traveler in that. I think that there are a lot of kind of blurred lines between what is a gap year and what is a micro college. And that might, get more sort of solidified as things go on and micro colleges become places that sort of carry their own accreditation or whatever. But I kind of hope not, because I like sort of, I don't know, having the loose boundaries.
Yeah, I think something I appreciate about you and your story is your willingness to start without knowing the end point, right? To try one schedule, one length of time, one group of students, one place, right? There's a sense there that there's something that needs to happen, something, an opportunity, a need that's the world is showing us, and some combination of these pieces, is necessary. And I think what's exciting for me is the idea of a bunch of places combining those pieces in different ways, right? And because then you really genuinely have a field of opportunities, 2-year programs, summer programs, semester programs, different geography, different kind of mixtures of the different pillars. So I guess as I'm thinking about what we're doing here, and as I identify, for example, who to talk to on this podcast, there's four kind of characteristics of programs that I'm loosely grouping in this movement. One, and we've talked about several of them. The first is humanly scaled, right? Because obviously our micro, they're small, and there's boundaries to that, but 6 to 100, something like that, right? There's a range. There is, I think, the place-based aspect is very important. So it is in a specific place, and that I would include Deep Springs in that, right? It is the voice of the desert, right? Its identity is shaped by its place in a way, and that's of course in contrast to other trends in education, which are just the opposite of place-based. They're remote, they're generic, they're there are other kind of ways that information is being exchanged and credentials are being done that have nothing to do with place, right? So place-based, humanly scaled, place-based. A holistic curriculum, right? We could say the 3 pillars. We've talked about 5 pillars here, but in any way, an education that's not just a brain in a jar, right? As you're saying, right? Something that engages the body. It also engages the social life, self-governance, a wider conception of communities, whether that's festivals or celebrations or just social artistry, different forms, but a holistic conception of education. And then the fourth, and the one that I really have yet to, I think, fully name in my own mind is, but the working title is meaning-centered or meaning-based. Mm-hmm. There's something that goes beyond the explicit content of the curriculum, whether that's skills or academics, and is acknowledging a purpose-based, meaning-based. It could be spiritual. It could be something that is sort of about vocation, but it's something, a deeper level to education. I wonder if you have any thought about that in your own programs or how you think about that aspect.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that it, in so many ways, it's kind of the most nebulous one, and therefore the most exciting, and therefore the one that everybody kind of like wants you to define. But I think it's actually for the best that at least this is the tack that I've taken, is that, okay, so all the time we have students who ask about the mission and are like, okay, what do you mean by citizenship, stewardship, and leadership? What do you mean by service? Like, please define that for me. And I have been really reluctant to ever define any of those terms for students, because I feel like that is exactly the conversation that they need to be having amongst themselves. And so I try to the extent possible, try to like instigate that and make them think about it. And a lot of that, I think, happens informally. Like, we don't have a part of our curriculum that is set aside for students to sit down and like talk about that. Although, there are times, within our curriculum. So we're hoping this next year to have a course about governing the community and the self. So, right, these can sort of be spaces that like get into those questions. But I think it's really important that students are engaging with and wrestling with those questions themselves, and that it's not just coming down as some sort of like didactic solution from the administration. Deep Springs was really good at this too. And I think, again, sort of informally and tacitly, and therefore really effectively, right? I heard so many conversations among students there about what it meant to live a life of service, including one student who I was there who like absolutely took the tack, my service to humanity is going to be to make a crap ton of money and donate it in the most effective way possible. And he is well on that route. And there were whatever, everybody else would like sort of gang up on him and like have big arguments about that particular philosophy of service. But right, it's great at provoking debate. And that's the sort of thing I love to see and encourage among students, if that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the willingness to hold open a space, right, to pose a question and not answer it, right, it's something that is actually inherent to the pedagogical model of the Waldorf schools, which are influencing us here. The teacher will pose a lot of questions and not answering them, and like overnight or ever, like, and that really it's a lot of generative space. And I think Deep Springs definitely does that as well. So this question of meaning, the trick is to keep the space open for it and not answer it, right? There's plenty of sectarian schools that say, yeah, this is the creed, this is what meaning is. And there's plenty of places that ignore the question, I think, as you're pointing to, like, okay, what's the connection between what we're doing here in the life of service, or just not answering, not addressing the question. The trick is to hold open the open space, right?
Yeah, precisely.
Do you see, is there a connection between, the labor or the kind of the context of this deep engagement with the place and the kind of the physical that you've got students engaged with there and this dynamic?
Yeah, for sure. So you're asking about the connection between labor and place,
or labor and labor and place with this question of meaning.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I mean, I think okay, so relationship between labor and meaning, I think that labor is the place that students most obviously are taking responsibility for the community around them. I think certainly this happens in self-governance and academics too, but it's so palpable in labor because literally you are cooking the food that your fellow students are eating. You are like whatever, fixing the fence that fell down so the moose don't get into the garden. If you don't, close the chickens in at night, we'll have whatever weasels or coyotes get in and eat them. So you're like really responsible to other living creatures, and there are real consequences and real stakes for the work that you're doing. And I think that's often one of the most meaningful parts of the program for students, is just feeling like you are being of service to the people around you. And then that could be really fulfilling. Likewise, I think that, many of our students are coming from educational backgrounds where they have not really ever been asked to do anything with their hands or like exist and manipulate the physical world in any kind of like meaningful way. So, for students to learn how to use a driver, fix a toilet, cook a meal, boil an egg, right? Like any of these things, I think is really meaningful as well, just because it's taking you into a plane of existence within an engagement with the world in a way that is, I think, increasingly closed off to a lot of people who live in urban environments and just sort of like live a modern lifestyle where, you just call the plumber if your toilet's broken. And then in terms of relationship to place, I think that the meaning element is there too, just because, one of the things we heard from so many students this year is, wow, like being so engaged with place here makes me realize how disengaged I am from place at home. And like, I love my home. I grew up there. We had a student this year who was like really committed to living in Appalachia and like loved it there. That was her home. She wants to like make it better in all of these different ways. But she was like, I cannot even identify like 24 plant species in Appalachia. I now know so many in Southeast Alaska. I really need to like make an effort to learn this when I go home so that I actually can learn my place. And I think that's super meaningful for students too.
Yeah, absolutely. That sense of being placeless is very closely connected to being to be meaningless, or to have a lack, having an absence, a real sense of void. Yeah. Can you talk a bit more about, one aspect of being place-based, at least for us here, is an engagement not only with the land and the wild animals and the plants, but also with the human communities. Can you talk about how that works where you are?
Yeah, absolutely. So that happens kind of in two primary ways. So we're a little bit about local history and geography. So we are here in Tlingit Ani, which is the ancestral homelands of the Tlingit people. We're specifically on the ancestral homelands of the Huna Tlingit, which is one like geographic community within the broader Tlingit nation. And that encompasses both of our campuses, both here in Gustavus and then out on the Indian Islands. There was enduring Tlingit presence here in the area around Gustavus until about 1750, when a major Little Ice Age glacier kind of advanced extremely quickly and pushed that community out of the area because literally everything became covered with ice. And so they dispersed and settled in what is now the town of Huna, which is across Icy Strait from us. So across this kind of thin body of water that separates us. And then when the glacier receded in the early 20th century, this area quickly became colonized by white settlers and remains a pretty white community, which is one of the challenges for Tidelines, in that we have a pretty diverse student community and we're bringing them up to a pretty white, pretty rural Alaskan town, which it can be a pretty daunting thing to ask of students. So we can talk more about that in a bit. We certainly have students engaged in a variety of ways in the Gustavus community, especially now that COVID is kind of letting up, although continued to be a little bit of an issue this summer. But there's just so much going on here. There's a really vibrant artistic community in town, scientific community in town, so many people with skills just all over the map, from boat building to, fruit tree husbandry to, we have a guy who's leading a workshop tonight, converting a diesel vehicle to an electric vehicle. And so we try to make all of that available to students to the extent that there are community members who are eager to teach and share what they know, and students who are eager to learn it. So I think we were pretty successful this year, and looking forward to continuing that going forward. I think that one of the most meaningful experiences for students, and also one of the most kind of important projects that Tidelines has been working on, both within and without the gap year, over the last several years, has been building our relationships with the Hoona Tlingit community. We are a place-based organization. This is Tlingit homeland. We are really grateful to get to be the stewards of these little places that exist on their homeland. And so I think we have a significant obligation to make sure that our programs are serving those communities too. So, we are now running programs, mostly short courses, in partnership with Hoona Indian Association, which is the tribal government in Hoona. We had a super beautiful totem pole dedication ceremony that has been a multi-year project between Tidelines and the tribe, that happened this September. And we took our gap year students to Hoona for a week-long field trip for the first time this summer, all of which were, just really amazing experiences, except that I got COVID during the field trip. That was not ideal. But that was just such an amazing way to acquaint students with the thousands of years of human history in this place, and to acquaint them with the continuing vibrancy of that culture. I think, that was one of the things that really impressed me and surprised me when I first moved up to Alaska is, I had lived all over, I lived all over the country. I've lived in every time zone now. And I had never lived anywhere with a really vibrant Native presence, because when I was living back east, most of those indigenous peoples were sent on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma or elsewhere. And then when I was living in the West, I think most indigenous folks were segregated onto reservations, and it's a totally different history, totally different story in Alaska. But Alaska Native culture is front and central and a part of kind of everybody's day-to-day experience just of living here. And that was totally novel for me when I first came here, and I think totally novel for students too.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a really unique kind of mixture of cultures there in a really special place. Yeah. Yeah,
it is.
So we're kind of heading up towards the top of the hour here, and I guess I'm wondering, you're a person I want to ask the big questions to, where does this movement go? What would be your hopes be for if you were looking out 20 years into the future? What is a young person finishing up with high school? What would they have to choose from, or what does the landscape look like if you had your say?
Yeah, this is a big question, and I'm terrible at answering questions if I could just design everything, control everything. I think in large part because I am a really pragmatic person, and I actually have a hard time, I don't know, spending mental energy on things that I don't think can be done. So I think so I guess I'll kind of start from the like pragmatic side of things and go from there. I think that the big factor is going to be what happens in the higher education space generally.
Mhm.
And that is going to determine a lot of where the microcollege movement can go and a lot of what students feel they can do. So the other kind of important person in my family with whom I talk about education quite a bit is my dad, who was a higher ed strategic planner for 30 years.
Hmm.
And his read on the situation is that higher ed in the US is a bubble that is going to burst any second, just like the housing bubble did in 2008. Because what students now demand from colleges is an incredible amount. What colleges charge is an incredible amount.
Mhm.
The debt that students are burdened with is an incredible amount. And all of that is just unsustainable. And something has got to give at some point. So, you know, I think it's a really live question whether the next 20 years are going to be an amazing time for educational innovation. And there are signs that it is, right? With all of these micro colleges starting to crop up and people really pushing back against the educational mainstream. I think the incidence of folks taking gap years is a good indication that people are looking for different things educationally. On the other hand, there are some worrying signs in that direction too. I mean, we've lost a few pretty well-established alternative colleges in the last few years. Green Mountain College, Hampshire College, Shimer College, Sweetbriar. I actually can't remember how the Sweetbriar story ended. And if they ended.
Still going. Marlborough College.
I'm sorry?
Marlborough.
Marlborough. Yeah. I knew I was forgetting one. So it's like, if all of these kind of better established institutions are not able to make it right now, what is going to happen with micro colleges? Will they be able to sustain themselves and thrive and grow? And I think the jury's a little bit out on that. I think I think a lot depends on what happens kind of generally with the economy. And I think to what extent micro colleges can make themselves accessible and affordable and offer a value proposition that students are willing to swallow. That is like such a sort of like non-inspiring answer, but that is like the big question that I'm thinking about kind of long-term in higher ed.
Yeah, it's an exciting and dynamic time, right? You could say as Silicon Valley people like to say, a lot of disruption going on.
Yes.
I mean, my sense is that there are there's certainly challenges. There are also real opportunities. I mean, in the established 4-year institutions that you mentioned, you know, they were tied to a particular model that was very expensive, right? And that's not just them, but many institutions of higher learning are that's part of the structure that change needs to come to. And so smaller institutions, more flexible institutions, different lengths of period time, like that seems to be part of the mix, at least in my sense.
Totally.
Yeah, maybe like so that's like, yeah, you're a pragmatic thinker, and I really can identify with that too. So I think it's a good challenge though to think about where what does a really healthful landscape look like, and this is where I have found the Scandinavian folk high school story so influential and important, because I think there is a model of sort of non-competitive higher education, place-based, you know, all these things we've been talking about that had a real historical, concrete impact on a particular set of societies. So maybe like as we come to the end here, I think, you know, you stewardship, citizenship, you know, these are part of your outcomes there. How do you see, you know, your students who go through your programs? How are they? How would you hope that they act in the world when they leave Gustavus?
Yeah, that's a really good question to end on. I I take a really kind of long view of education. In fact, so my husband is a co-director of Tidelines Institute. We talk about this all the time because he is he's a climate scientist and activist and really focused kind of like on, okay, we need to be producing climate leaders like now. And so that is a super big focus of all of the short courses, which is kind of his wheelhouse, whereas I spend more time at the gap year. So, I think that there are models of education that very appropriately are focused in a very concrete way on getting students from point A to point B. Like, X, Y, and Z about the climate now. And by the time you come out of this course, you will know A, B, and C, and you will be able to act in the following ways. And the hope is that you will. My approach is much more focused on the long term and therefore much more nebulous. And it makes it challenging when people are like, please measure your outcomes
right.
on like a scale of 1 to 10. And I'm like, well, okay, I guess we'll try to do that. But I would be happy and have been happy to see our students take on leadership positions and take careers in a super wide variety of fields. We do have an alum now who is in the leadership of the Sunrise Movement. We have an alum who is an officer in the Marine Corps. We have an alum who just got a full ride to Oxford to study literature. We have an alum who is like working on like methane emission capture technology and like actually that is one of the short course alumni. I should not claim her as a I'm thinking generally about Tidelines alums. But I think the big approach of our educational model, and one of the things that I feel really deeply about liberal education in general, is that it needs to liberate students from the tyranny of their own preconceptions and to liberate students from the prison of the status quo, right? Like assuming that the way things are is just like the way things are and will be and should be. We have no idea what problems we are going to be facing in 20 years or 50 years, or maybe we have some idea. And to the extent that we do, those problems are really big. And we are going to need students who can think really creatively and empathetically in a whole variety of different trajectories. So that's, I think, the educational goal that we are trying to lead our students towards, is just to have that depth, clarity, creativity, and empathy of thought that they can apply to whatever the pressing problem seems to them to be. And how we measure that on a scale of 1 to 10, I don't know. But I hope that, we'll get to hear those stories coming out of alums as they grow up and kind of take their place in the world. And I would say that the stories that we have been hearing thus far have been really exciting and encouraging. So I hope that continues to be the case.
Yeah, I think I don't know if we'll ever know how to measure it, but I think, we'll know how it looks, because I think what I would just observe is that you are modeling that really well, right? The idea of like seeing a big problem, having some sense of the outlines of it, and sticking with it continuously for a long period of time, flexibly, resiliently, creatively. So again, I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to us today. I really admire your work and your tenacity. And maybe, could you just say the program runs from early summer to late autumn? If people are interested in joining the year, what's the application like, and when do they need to be in touch with you?
Sure. So all of the application information is available on our website at tidelinesinstitute.org. The application deadline is the end of the calendar year if you want to find out early, and otherwise it's February 1st. It is a pretty straightforward written application, demographic section, what you major in, where you go to school, and then 2 essays and a creative or kind of additional fun supplement. And then we'll do interviews probably starting in about a month or 6 weeks for students who apply by the early deadline, and then a little bit later for students who apply by the February 1st deadline. We ask for references, and that's it. We also offer 100% financial aid based on need. So yeah, hope that finances will not be a barrier for any student who wants to apply.
Awesome. Amazing. Yeah. So this is we're recording this in mid-December 2022, and probably this will be our first podcast posted at the very beginning of 2023. So that February 1st deadline is the one for people to look for, and I really can't imagine a better person to start the year talking to here. So thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Jacob. It's great to see you.
All right.